Okay, we are ready to use the Dremel tool. Before we start, we certainly want to make sure that we have our safety glasses on because the Dremel does produce a considerable amount of dust, just like any other sander would. It's on a little bit of a smaller scale, but the fact that it's producing dust and will also shoot dust away from the material means we want to make sure our safety glasses are on. I'm over by our dust collection system and I have this grid here, and normally if I would be using it, I would turn it on. Like I said, it does produce a lot of dust, and by using this grid, we'll make sure that we collect as much of that dust as possible and it doesn't go flying all over the place. I have a sanding bit. This is the small sanding bit because I'm going to be doing some intricate work, and you want to try to do as much as you can with the disc sander and the spindle sander before you move to the Dremel, because while this can remove a lot of material relatively quickly, it does take a time investment to use it, and the disc sander and spindle sander are going to work considerably faster. Now, before I put the bit in, I want to show you some of the settings that are on here. Sometimes these tools have a high and low setting. As you can see, we have high and low and off. Some of the Dremels only have either off or high. This one has all three settings. So if we were to turn it on to low, it would spin much slower than if we turned it on to high. Now, before we plug this thing in, we want to make sure that it is in the off position. Otherwise, when we plug it in, it's going to turn on. And when we plug it in, we want to make sure that there's no bit in there. So if it actually accidentally does turn on, at least there's no bit to do any damage. So it's in the off position. I've plugged the tool in. If I turn it to the low setting, you can hear how fast it spins, and the high setting. So I have the machine off and I'm ready to put the bit in. What I would want to do is insert the bit into the tool, hold down the brake, so this silver button is going to brake the collet from being able to move, and I'm going to tighten it by hand and then use the wrench to tighten it a little bit more, just like we would with the chuck key and the drill press. So I have my bit installed. I'm going to check it to make sure that it is nice and tight in there, and I'm ready to start the Dremel. So I have a little bit of an intricate design here. It'd be very difficult for me to use the spindle sander on there. So I'm going to get in there with the Dremel bit to smooth that out a little bit and to kind of work on the edges to smooth out the edges a little bit. But before I start, it's important to note that the tool itself is going to produce dust, and it's going to produce it in a certain direction. So it's not going to just produce dust in all directions. It's going to produce it a certain way. So if we look at a diagram of the actual sanding wheel itself, it's going to rotate in this direction. And it's important to note the direction in which your bit is spinning, because as it contacts the material, it's going to produce dust almost in a straight line perpendicular to that wheel or the center axis of the wheel, and you can almost look and see that it's essentially tangent to the material surface. So if we drew a line down from the center, wherever it touches that material, if we drew a line that was perpendicular to that center point, that's essentially the direction in which the dust is going to move. And that's important to note, because if I was to use the Dremel tool this way, the wheel is actually spinning in this direction. So what would happen is as the bit contacted the material, it would actually push all of these dust back towards me. So what I'm going to do first is I'm going to check the direction, and it is spinning this way, which means it would hit the material and then spin it towards me. So I need to use it in this fashion, which is going to push it towards that sanding grid. Checking the direction is important because it's the difference between the dust going into the collection system or coming right back at you. It can produce splinters. It usually just converts everything to dust, but it can shoot some splinters at you. So make sure you're watching which way the bit turns, and the direction of the dust should be pointed towards that sanding grid. So what I was able to do was just smooth out the edges a little bit, and just like any of our sanders, we don't want to leave the bit in one spot for too long. We don't want to apply too much pressure to the material because that's going to cause excessive friction and you could scorch the actual material itself. When you scorch the material, you're actually heating up the bit to a temperature that's pretty high. I think wood typically scorches at around 500, 600, 700 degrees, and you could damage the bit itself. So I went very smoothly. I was actually using two hands, so I was moving the material around with one hand while also moving the Dremel tool around with the other one. The closer you get to this screen, the more dust it's going to collect. If I was done, what I would do is engage the lock, remove the bit, and I could put the tool back.